Back about 10 years or so ago, my good friend and I would occasionally take trips to her family's property out in the middle of nowhere. It was fairly remote. You'd had to drive up a dirt road a few miles and couldn't access it unless you had a key to the chain on the gate. There wasn't anyone around for miles. All that was there was a trailer they had towed up and left to sleep in. The feel out there was always a little off. One day we were wandering around the property, not really thinking of much, and so about 20 minutes later, when we realized we had actually been walking out into the middle of nowhere, we had no water with us and had no clue where we were. Luckily, we found a way back after a while, but neither of us could explain why we did that. I'd also take my voice recorder, and we caught up quite a few strange things on it. One day before heading out there, we were talking about Skinwalker Ranch. It was only about a 40-minute drive from the property, so we thought, hey, why don't we go try to find it? We thought it would be cool to say that we had been there. After searching the internet, we found fairly good directions there and headed out for the night. We had a bit of trouble locating it, but after a bit of driving around, we pulled into an area that was spot on from the descriptions we had read. We stepped out of the car, and the first thing we noticed was the mass amounts of bugs swarming us. Only a few short seconds later, we had huge dogs barking, growling, and running at us. We immediately jumped back in the car and took off. We ended up staying in the area for a little longer, exploring. Later that night, back at her property, we were sitting around the fire talking when all of a sudden, we started hearing barking. It was rather startling, and she immediately froze. She said she had never heard barking in this area before. She isn't one to get scared easily, so her uneasiness put me on the edge. Not too long after that, there was more barking. Very slowly, we were being surrounded by what I assumed were coyotes. We both tried yelling, jumping around, and throwing rocks, but that didn't seem to do any good. I had never seen coyotes act this way. We were terrified and had no clue what to do. Not really wanting to stick around and find out if they get any closer to us, we doused the fire and flipped on our flashlights. She grabbed my hand, and we booked it back into the trailer. We were both shaking by the time we made it in, and she locked the door. I don't think either of us slept that well. I heard a lot of weird sounds and felt a sense of dread the entire night. As soon as the sun started to rise, we decided to pack up and get out of there. We'd need the car, and what we saw sent chills down my spine. On the driver's side car window was a huge handprint made with mud. It was easily twice the size of our hands. We looked at each other and silently agreed that we needed to get the hell out of there. I'm not saying it was a skinwalker, but neither of us have been able to explain it, and I've never been back. I grew up on the countryside, right next to a national park frequently visited by nature lovers and bird enthusiasts. It was the kind of park where you're not really allowed to bike or ride horses, only walk or run. But, tenacious as I was, I felt that this was a stupid rule, and so I did anyway because the trails were perfect for it. I knew fully well that I wasn't supposed to do that, and was caught a few times, but nothing much came of it apart from a half-hearted "don't do it again." And of course, I did, until one day something frightening happened that made me stop. My family were horse breeders, and I would often take them on horse rides, usually into the forbidden park. This day, very early in the morning, the first day of summer holiday, it was beautiful outdoors, misty and foggy, near the sky that promised a sunny day ahead. Since it was so early, before 6 a.m., I knew that there wouldn't be anyone on the trail to see me, so I set the horse off at full speed along the trail. I only slowed down on the part of the trail that got steep on one side, leading down to the river, because the thought of one step too close to the edge was too much, even for a kid with next to no non-existent risk assessment skills. Suddenly, the horse came to a halt and refused to take another step. I grew up with horses all my life, and I knew that this usually indicates that you need to investigate. Is there something with the hooves? Did the horse spot something that spooked it? So I checked, and the hooves were fine, but the horse didn't move an inch. And that's when I saw it. Someone had set a trap. A thin, sharp metal wire across the trail in perfect neck height for an adult. I stopped and looked around but didn't see anyone. The wire was well attached to 2 trees and impossible for me to remove. So I led the horse around it, and to do so, I had to walk up a bit into the wooded area on the side of the trail. That's when I heard this singing. The song is called Hey Thumbed Engelbert, and it was that particular melody, but the lyrics were different and sung in a muffled, sniggering voice. Imagine Smeagol from Lord of the Rings. Today, I only remember parts of it, but translated, it would have been something like, "Hey, all you runners, come here passing, let the lifeblood pour out." I, as silently as I could, and with my heart in my throat, backed away and got up on the horse and hurried back the way I came as fast as I could. I knew I had to tell someone about it, but at the same time, I wanted to avoid admitting to riding a huge and very forbidden horse on those protected trails. So now, I had a problem. The old stories about a mad old man living in the shed in the woods, a shed that was once a cottage for a local hunter, came back as I hung on the horse for dear life. I got home and told my older brother what had happened, and he went back there with me in tow. We found the wire trap, and after a while of searching, we also found a spear-like pole in the ground, right on the spot that you'd land after you came running and jumped over the fallen tree on the trail. That's when we called the police. The area was searched, and several similar traps were found, but there was no sight of the old man. In the following days, there was big news in the local paper about spear-like poles being found right under the water surface, directly under the little tower you're supposed to dive from at the lake. Additionally, black garbage bags filled with big rocks were found on the narrow bridge crossing the river. If a car had hit it, there's a chance it would have gone off the road and straight into the water. I live in a small town in rural Australia. I'm a cyclist, and I coordinate sport events, marathons, and sell bike gear and whatnot. Around 6 a.m., I drove my bike up the mountains. On the way, I passed a woman sitting by the side of the road. At first, I thought she may have been a hitchhiker, but there were no hotels around, and she had no bags. I stopped my car about 400 meters away from her, grabbed a bottle out of the car boot, and walked down to see what was going on. At that moment, I realized she was one of the most gorgeous women that I had ever seen. She was probably in her 20s, pale as hell, with long wavy blonde hair to her hips, and one of those really German hourglass figures with these deep blue eyes. She was wearing one of those long summer dresses that beach kids seem to love, which was frigging weird for the middle of the Australian bush. So I walked up to her like, oh my god, but I'm also thinking, what the hell? I handed her the bottle of water and asked her if she was lost or needed a lift back to town. She just stared at me, didn't take the water, and didn't blink. I thought, oh shit, is she some kind of crazy? So I asked if she ran away from somewhere, and she just says, no, and hadn't blinked yet. So I ask her if she's waiting for someone to come pick her up, and she says, no, again. I asked her where her house is, and she says, here. Keep in mind, I am halfway up a mountain, and there are no houses here at all. So I was kind of starting to get creeped out by this lady. I walked back to my Jeep, and I was going to start driving back down the mountain and call the cops and get them to come pick up this lady. And she follows me. I was like, look, are you sure you don't want me to run you back to town? And she just says, no, again. So I'm more like, look, I don't feel comfortable leaving you here in the middle of nowhere. Please let me take you to the police station. And she just turns around and walks off into the bush, miles from anywhere. And I'm sitting there like, what the actual hell? And then I started to get really scared when the bug and bird noises started to come back. It made me realize I hadn't heard a single other sound whilst I was speaking to her. No magpies, no crickets, no early morning sounds at all. I hightailed out of there and called the local coppers when I reached the bottom of the mountain. Basically, I said, there's a woman up in the mountain who refused to get into my car, and then realized how stupid that sounded and hung up. Whoever you are, I hope that you're okay. Back when I was in the Boy Scouts, we took a trip to the Pine Barrens. I was around 11 or 12 years old. I always remember these kinds of trips to be memorable, with all the hiking and fishing we would do. My troop and I finished setting up the site around dusk when we started making food for all of us. When it started to get late, everyone gathered around the campfire talking. I decided to take a walk to the latrine. It was about a quarter-mile away from the site, illuminated by a light post. I went inside and did my business. I knew it wasn't too far from the site and the scouts for me to feel any sense of being alone, but I just felt like something was off. As I was about to finish my business, I heard something else at the door. It sounded like something walking on the gravel trail. I decided to be a bit brave and look outside. What I saw is burned into my mind for life. It was a creature, hunched over, sniffing at the ground. It looked like a deer on two legs, but this was different. It had a forked tail, large bat wings, and its head was like a horse's, but with horns, more like antlers. It had hooves and claws too. Its eyes were glowing red, unnatural for anything I'd ever seen. I sat there looking at it for no more than 30 seconds before it stopped and stared directly at me. I immediately closed the door. Now it was nighttime, but I knew what I saw, and it was standing underneath the lamppost. I was far too young to drink or do drugs, and the skies were clear. I kept thinking to myself that if I stay in there, it may leave. Then I heard it walking. The sound of its hooves coming closer to the latrine grew louder. I tried peeking out the small hole in the wood, but I noticed a shadow covering it. I sat frozen. I started scratching at the wood door. My heart was beating out of my chest. I could literally hear it breathing. Then I heard a sound that I will never forget. A blood-curdling scream ripped through the air. It sounded like a bat, but louder, or a woman screaming, but more distorted. I felt tears running down my face. The sound of its hooves on the gravel started stomping away. I looked out the door one more time and saw it open its wings in a full sprint and leap into the air. It disappeared into the night. I waited about 5 minutes before I ran back to the site. Everyone was wondering what that sound was, and they started laughing, thinking it was me trying to scare them. I couldn't even think to sleep. I stayed in my tent, holding my pocket knife in my hand. I heard the scouts outside telling stories by the fire. Then I heard them tell a story about a creature with wings, a horse head, hooves, and red eyes. As I ran out of my tent and told them that's what I saw, that's what made them scream, they all looked at me like I was crazy. I started crying and telling them it was true. All their faces turned white and they started freaking out. The scoutmaster told everyone to pack up, and we were leaving. I found out that that creature was called the Jersey Devil. After seeing it with my own eyes, before knowing the legend, I can tell you it's real. I will never enter the Pine Barrens of New Jersey ever again. It was around 10 at night off the Little Waves from Ocean City, Maryland. It was my mother, her friend, my sister, and I. We were driving home from our vacation, and I asked if we could take the back roads. I always loved seeing the woods at night, and it was the scenic route we were driving down. And although I was the one who asked for the trees, I was ironically on my phone, texting and listening to music. We eventually came to a stretch of road that I didn't pay much attention to. It was boring, but I occasionally looked up every now and then, as I did the entire ride. It was a straight path forward with nothing but streetlights. So we were driving and driving as we crossed under the lights. It was almost relaxing. I went into a half-sleep trance. Then I suddenly woke up, and everything was fine. More lights as we drove by. No one was talking. My mom's boyfriend wasn't asleep, but there were no muffled conversations. Everything seemed calm, but I had this sudden awareness. We were in the middle of the woods. It was dark, and around 11:30 or 12 o'clock, without streetlights, you couldn't see anything but the stars. I immediately felt very paranoid. I turned my phone on and listened to the music. Then we entered back into another stretch of light and drove on, and I started to feel a little bit better. This part is strange because it was as if something told me to go to my phone, as if there was a notification. I checked, and there was nothing there. And then, I noticed something in my obscured vision. There were about 4 lights up ahead that were turned off in an area where the road kind of turns. It was a fairly wooded area. You couldn't see much without the light, so we slowed down. I didn't pay much attention to it, but this next part sticks with me. As we slowly approached the next light that was on, something crawled out from the woods and into the light. I looked up and thought it was a deer at first, but it kept moving. Out, it was limping. But when it fully emerged, what I saw was truly bone-chilling. A naked, ash-white, skinny man crawled out on all 4s. It stopped, and as I saw it, it turned its head at us. Its eyes were deep, charcoal black. We sped up fast and started driving. It wasn't human. As we drove past it, it jumped over our car weightlessly, defying physics. My mom's Mercedes had 2 sunroofs, and although it was a blur, I got a close look at it as it passed over the car, landed behind us, and faded into the black. The scary part was when it jumped over our car. Our sunroof was open. I lived alone in a remote location where we didn't have cable or anything, so the only option was satellite TV. It was a humid summer night in July, and the TV was acting up, so I needed to go out and readjust the satellite like usual. I took a flashlight and a gun with me when I went outside. It was unusually quiet, so silent that it was unnerving. I brushed the thought off, then went to the dish, which was in the corner of my yard. I went to work making sure all the wires were all right and pointing it into a different angle. Suddenly I heard a small snap of a stick to my left. I turned my flashlight in that direction and saw a creature standing there. I got a good look at it for what seemed like an eternity, but it was probably only about 10 seconds. I slowly backed away and ran back to my house, locking all the doors and windows. The creature was unlike anything I had ever seen before. When I shone the light at it, the first thing I saw was the head. It had cropped ears that pointed upwards. Its snout was narrower than a bear's, and longer than I could imagine a canine. I could make out large teeth protruding from the jaw. Its eyes were a deep red shade that seemed to reflect off the light as I was pointing at it. The body was muscular and huge. It had long arms that appeared to be longer than its legs. Broad shoulders had tapered into a skinnier waist. It was slightly crouched over when I saw it, with one hand wrapped around a small tree. I could make out the legs, which were similar to a dog's. It had an obvious hock. Even with the crouched position, I could tell that its height was probably 6 feet or more. Standing up to full height, this creature could easily be 7.5 feet tall. Its fur was black and thicker around the neck and chest. The bottom half was significantly less so, almost like it was balding. I don't know if it was aggressive or not. What I do know is that I felt a feeling of dread, unlike I have ever experienced before. Was it just observing me or stalking me? For a creature this large, it was deceivingly silent. It got within 15 yards of me without ever noticing. At my grandparents' on vacation to Iowa, they live in the middle of nowhere, couple elderly neighbors, and cornfields for miles. It was around 2 a.m., and I was going to go have a smoke before bed. Their back porch has a big sliding door. Well, I walk into the room with the sliding door, and there's a guy in a creepy mask. He's quietly wiggling the door, trying to open it. I got so scared, I felt my butthole clench up, and I dropped my cigarette. Right then, the guy freezes and looks right at me. He pauses, then starts frantically shaking the door, trying to open it. Like, this dude was trying to rip the door off the house. I run over to my grandparents' gun cabinet and grab something. By the time I looked around to point it at him, he was gone. I ran and woke up my grandparents. We all walked around the house with loaded guns for a minute, but the guy was gone. A couple of weeks later, some bald guy walked out of a cornfield wearing a dress. He stood by the highway for half an hour, then got picked up by some sketchy car. I won't even go into cornfields in broad daylight anymore. It was around 11 p.m. at night. We wanted to visit a graveyard, so we ended up going to Butte Cemetery near South Mountain in Phoenix. As we were pulling in, a coyote dashed across the car and ran toward the mountains. It looked weird, like one of those overbred incest German shepherds that are all short and hunched over, but I didn't think too much of it. We parked and walked away from the car and explored the graveyard. There were no signs of people or coyotes, but whenever we walked near a bush or a tree, we heard rustling, but we figured it was just some sort of rodent or bats. When we were done, we walked toward the car to leave, but we saw a cool little gated sanctuary garden type thing, so we went in there and sat for a little while. All of a sudden, we heard what sounded like a weird mix of a laugh, scream, and howl. I was confused as to what this inhuman scream was at first, so my mind immediately translated it to multiple coyotes, a pack. We were about to leave, and then we saw 4 sets of glowing eyes crouching and coming toward us fast. I still figured it was an angry coyote pack, so we ran to the car. After being safe in the car, we got a little more ballsy and tried to find them. They were nowhere to be seen. I saw 3, maybe 4 shadows of human figures on the other side of the graveyard from the car. I thought to myself, wow, there are people here this late. I wonder why we didn't see or hear them. It's a pretty small, flat, and treeless graveyard, basically just dirt and desert. So I'm pretty positive we would have known if there were others. Their shadows disappeared for a while, but I'm still looking toward that direction. That's when I saw the weirdest figure hunched over, walking in the most awkward way. The way its body moved was swift and unnatural. It was in the same direction where I saw the people. We drove over to that direction and found nothing, and left. We got home when we noticed the car scratched up everywhere, like a coyote was going crazy on top of the car. The scratches were long and dragged in different directions, and a few dirt paw prints all over the car. We had a car wash the next day, and the car was completely untouched before, and I'm pretty sure of that. We also left a McFlurry in the trunk of the car, which was untouched and not moved. If coyotes got on the car, it definitely would have been destroyed, considering how dramatic the scratches were. So yeah, I'm wondering if what we saw were skinwalkers. The graveyard is also near a reservation, and it seemed like a lot of Arizona pioneers and natives were buried there. Here in Canada, I have in-laws way up north in a place called the Northwest Territories. They're native and have a lot of weird tales from their community. They have family spread all over the north, a lot of them who are in Alberta as well, and we'll play into this story. So it was a typical winter night, maybe 10-ish years ago, at my in-laws' grandparents' house. Not that late or anything, but very dark due to that time of year. And it was way too cold to be outside, at least -45°C or -49 degrees. Everyone was just hanging out and watching TV. Kids were playing, in a typical average kind of night, you know. Suddenly there is knocking at the door. Hard, persistent knocking. This was immediately strange as they live away outside of any town, with kilometers between neighbors, and unannounced guests are almost unheard of. Their grandparents are visibly concerned and tell them not to answer the door. The knocking became harder, and the guests began to speak loudly, stating that they were Auntie So and that they had been invited over. The kids wanted to answer the door to see their auntie. Apparently it sounded exactly like her. So their grandpa had to block the kids from going near the door and tell them to get away from the door and the windows as well. The knocking became pounding, and the guests started yelling and screaming angrily to be let in. Eventually it stopped, and the guest was gone. The next morning, there were no tracks outside in the snow, and no signs of a vehicle had been in the area. This auntie lived in Alberta and had made no plans to visit. Anyway, that's about it. Not much for excitement, but that kind of shit is weirdly common out here in some places. Believe it or not, Wendigo is a major piece of folklore in that family as well, and they refuse to talk about it out of fear of drawing one in. A few months back, I was on a routine third shift. I work as a police officer in a very small town in Ohio. It was currently the middle of fall. I'm not going to say where, but people can find it pretty easily. Anyway, I was on night patrol, driving in my patrol car. Most nights we are required to get out of our cruisers to check areas our cruisers can't fit. There's a super long, almost 2-mile bike path we are supposed to walk down. Well, one night, as usual, I got out and walked the path. Usually we do this to make sure no one is hurt or overdosed. My flashlight was dimmed during the walk since I forgot to put it on the charger earlier that day. About a mile into the walk, I started to feel very strange. Not a typical gut feeling, but a feeling that you know something is wrong or something is about to go wrong. I began to hear leaves crunching. Turning in every direction, the leaves would break. My light was so dim, it was hard to see much of anything. I continued, trying to get this walk over with. I started to speed up. In doing so, I must have triggered something's instinct. Every time I sped up, the breaking of leaves would get louder and continue with my pace. I got to the point where I knew something was there, so I just stopped and listened. I waited for 5 minutes, hoping to catch some kids playing a prank or a fellow officer trying to get a laugh. But nothing. The sounds had stopped. I began shining my light all around me, slowly turning my light from the tree to tree. Then, I noticed something odd. I had passed by it the first time. I shined my light back in the direction I noticed from earlier. I could see something, but at the time it was hard to make out. The only difference I noticed was the contrast in colors. Old gray and black with red and orange leaves in a brown tree. I shined my light up from it, and then 2 huge glowing eyes. Nothing like I have ever seen before. I have seen deer, wolves, and other animal eyes that reflect light, but nothing like this. I hesitated, almost drawing my firearm, but I stopped myself, knowing that I could get myself in trouble if it was a prankster. This thing took 1 step out from behind the tree. I got a whole body view. It was covered in feathers, extremely tall, and didn't appear to be completely human. I noticed it had hands like a human, but it having feathers that looked almost forced into the skin. I started to back up. Thankfully, it never moved more than when it did earlier. I was frozen in fear, too scared to move, but I snapped out of it when dispatch radioed. "Police 1, check up." The sounds of the radio snapped me out of my trance. I started walking backwards very quickly, not taking my eyes off this thing. One time, it felt like forever, but I finally got back out of those woods. My cruiser was in the clearing. I bolted as fast as I could to it, not looking back until I got back in. I looked into the wood line from where I came in. Then, I could see this thing's whole body. It had shaped like a demonic owl head, laying tilted, just staring with its huge eyes. Its body was covered in some parts by feathers, either by skin that appeared to be falling off like it was rotting. Then, a terrible odor came through. So powerful, it is engraved into my memory. I unlocked my cruiser, crawled in, and locked the doors. I attempted to shine my spotlight and brights at it, but it ran back into the woods, letting out a scream that was like no other. I could feel the creature's bellow rattle my insides, leaving me almost sick to my stomach. After it ran, I drove back up to my station, sitting inside to recap what had just happened. They asked my fellow officers about it sometime later, but got very odd responses. I was being told to never look where the noises came from. It would be better if I just ignored them altogether. I was confused at this point, wondering if they had seen it themselves, but I was never given a definitive answer, just told to keep my light charged and my eyes forward. Just to clarify, this didn't happen to me. It happened to my girlfriend a year or 2 ago. Nevertheless, I always get freaked out whenever I'm in her woods. There have been 2 incidents, so I'll try to make them quick. One night, she had a few of her friends over, laughing, drinking, and having a good time in general. They did all their little parties in her dad's garage, which was a few yards away from the house. Beyond the garage was an unkempt path that led into the woods behind her house. Across from the garage was an old trampoline that was too ripped up to be able to jump on. They decided to head back in when it got dark. My girlfriend has a big black dog. I'm not sure of the breed, but they definitely knew she was inside at the time. Right before entering the house, my girlfriend looked at the trampoline and saw a pair of bright yellow shining eyes, almost cat-like. She called her friends over and they saw it too. Her dog, Jasmine, was right behind them in the house when Jasmine let out her bark. The thing took off at an inhuman speed. The morning after, they found long claw marks on the side of the garage. The second time was when my girlfriend was taking a walk on a small trail through the woods. She has schizophrenia, so she does hallucinate a lot, but she swears that she knew what she saw was real. About halfway down the trail, through dense shrubbery, she saw a grayish thing. It was walking on all fours, and its limbs looked twisted, like it wasn't assembled right. But it definitely looked human to her. She waited for whatever it was to pass before running back home. We never go out to her woods alone anymore, especially at night, or without a weapon. She believes her woods belong to Wendigos, or maybe skinwalkers. She couldn't tell very well. One thing is for certain, something strange is living in her forest.